The general sought a volunteer, the modest clerk, shocked the crowd by overpowering the master sergeant. The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as soldiers gathered for their daily drills. Among them stood Thomas Chen, a quiet man in his early 30s who worked as a clerk in the administrative office. His wire-rimmed glasses and soft-spoken manner made him nearly invisible among the sea of uniformed personnel. Most days Thomas preferred it that way. He had joined the army not for glory or adventure, but for steady work and the chance to serve his country in whatever small way he could. Thomas had grown up in a modest household where his father worked double shifts at a factory and his mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. Physical confrontation was something he had always avoided. In school, he was the student who helped others with homework, not the one who played sports or got into fights. His classmates often overlooked him, and teachers appreciated his quiet diligence. When bullies targeted smaller kids, Thomas would find clever ways to distract them or alert teachers rather than face them directly. The army base buzzed with its usual energy that Tuesday morning. Soldiers jogged in formation, their boots hitting the pavement in perfect rhythm. The sound of drill sergeants barking commands echoed across the grounds. Thomas walked carefully between the training areas, carrying a stack of personnel files that needed updating. He wore the same uniform as everyone else, but somehow it seemed to hang differently on his slight frame. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was conducting combat training near the main courtyard. Rodriguez had earned his reputation through years of service and countless demonstrations of his physical prowess. Standing 6 feet tall with arms like tree trunks, he commanded respect through both his military record and his intimidating presence. Younger soldiers often whispered stories about his strength, how he could bench press twice his body weight, and had once single-handedly subdued 3 unruly recruits during a training exercise. General Morrison was making his weekly inspection rounds, accompanied by several junior officers. The general was known throughout the base for his sharp mind and fair leadership, but also for his unconventional methods of testing his personnel. He believed that true character revealed itself in unexpected moments, not during planned evaluations. His gray hair and weathered face spoke of decades of military service, and his keen eyes seemed to notice details that others missed. As the general's group approached the training area, Rodriguez was demonstrating proper grappling techniques to a circle of eager recruits. His movements were precise and powerful, each motion calculated to showcase both technique and strength. The young soldiers watched in awe as he explained the importance of leverage and timing in hand-to-hand combat. Thomas continued his quiet walk along the edge of the courtyard, trying to stay out of everyone's way. He had always been fascinated by the training exercises from a distance, though he never imagined participating in them. His role was to maintain records, process paperwork, and ensure that administrative tasks ran smoothly. Physical combat seemed as foreign to him as flying to the moon. The general paused his inspection to observe Rodriguez's demonstration. He nodded approvingly as the master sergeant explained various defensive positions and offensive techniques. The recruits hung on every word, knowing that these skills might one day save their lives. Rodriguez commanded the training ground with the confidence of someone who had proven himself countless times. During a break in the demonstration, the general approached Rodriguez with what appeared to be casual interest. They spoke in low tones while the recruits stretched and hydrated. Thomas noticed their conversation but continued focusing on his own tasks, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the files in his hands. The morning breeze carried the sounds of military life across the base. Helicopters could be heard in the distance, and the steady hum of activity created a familiar backdrop. Thomas had grown accustomed to these sounds over his 3 years of service, finding comfort in their predictability. His work might not be glamorous, but it was important, and he took pride in doing it well. Rodriguez resumed his demonstration, this time inviting volunteers from the watching soldiers to practice the techniques he had shown. Several eager recruits stepped forward, each hoping to impress both their instructor and the visiting general. The exercises proceeded as expected, with Rodriguez easily managing each volunteer while providing constructive feedback. Thomas found himself involuntarily slowing his pace as he passed the training area. Something about the energy of the moment caught his attention, though he could not quite identify what it was. The general's presence seemed to add extra intensity to the usual training routine. And even Rodriguez appeared more focused than usual. The administrative work that normally occupied Thomas's entire attention suddenly seemed less urgent. He had always wondered what it would feel like to possess the confidence and physical capability that soldiers like Rodriguez displayed so naturally. Not that he harbored any illusions about his own abilities, but the curiosity had always lingered in the back of his mind. As he stood watching from the periphery, Thomas noticed how the other soldiers looked at Rodriguez with a mixture of respect and intimidation. The master sergeant had earned his position through years of proving himself, and his reputation was well-deserved. Thomas could not imagine ever commanding that kind of respect or inspiring that level of awe in others. The general's sharp eyes continued to scan the assembled group, though Thomas did not realize he had become part of the scene being observed. To Thomas, he remained an invisible clerk going about his daily duties. He had no way of knowing that his quiet presence had not gone unnoticed, or that the morning's routine was about to take an unexpected turn. The training session was reaching its natural conclusion when the general made a decision that would change everything. His request for a volunteer would soon transform an ordinary Tuesday morning into something none of them would ever forget, least of all the modest clerk who thought he was just passing by. The general stepped forward, his authoritative voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Master Sergeant Rodriguez," he called out, loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. "I'd like to see a demonstration of advanced combat techniques, something that would challenge even an experienced fighter." Rodriguez straightened immediately, his chest swelling with pride at the opportunity to showcase his skills before the base commander. "Yes, sir. What would you like me to demonstrate?" General Morrison surveyed the crowd of soldiers, his experienced eyes taking in each face. "I want to see how you handle an opponent who might not fight conventionally. Someone unexpected." He paused deliberately. "I need a volunteer." The eager recruits who had participated earlier began stepping forward again, but the general raised his hand to stop them. His gaze swept across the assembled group, past the obvious volunteers, past the confident young soldiers, and settled on the quiet figure standing at the edge of the courtyard. "You there," the general called out, pointing directly at Thomas. "The clerk with the files. Would you step forward?" Thomas looked around in confusion, certain the general must be addressing someone else. When he realized all eyes were on him, his face flushed red. "Me, sir? I think there's been some mistake. I'm just delivering paperwork." "No mistake," the general replied firmly. "I'd like you to volunteer for this demonstration." The courtyard fell silent except for the distant sounds of base operations. Thomas felt his heart racing as dozens of soldiers turned to stare at him. This was his worst nightmare, being the center of attention in a situation where he was completely out of his element. He clutched his files tighter as if they might somehow shield him from this unwanted spotlight. "Sir, with all due respect," Thomas said quietly, his voice barely audible, "I'm not trained for combat demonstrations. I work in administration. I process forms and maintain records. I've never even been through advanced combat training." Master Sergeant Rodriguez looked puzzled by the general's choice. He had expected to face another soldier, someone with at least basic fighting skills. The idea of demonstrating techniques on a mild-mannered clerk seemed almost absurd. "General, perhaps one of the other soldiers would be more appropriate for this type of demonstration." But General Morrison's expression remained unchanged. "I specifically requested this soldier. Sometimes the best lessons come from unexpected situations." He looked directly at Thomas. "Are you willing to serve when your general asks?" Thomas felt trapped. His entire military training had emphasized the importance of following orders and supporting the chain of command. Refusing a direct request from the base commander would be unthinkable, regardless of his personal comfort. He set his files down carefully on a nearby bench and removed his glasses, tucking them into his shirt pocket. "I'll do my best, sir," Thomas said, though his voice carried no conviction. The watching soldiers began whispering among themselves. Some felt sympathy for the clerk who was about to be embarrassed in front of the entire group. Others were curious to see how Rodriguez would handle such an unusual opponent. A few seemed annoyed that their training time was being wasted on what appeared to be a pointless exercise. Rodriguez approached Thomas with professional courtesy, but obvious reluctance. He had built his reputation on fair fights and proper demonstrations, This felt more like a mismatch that could only end with the clerk being humiliated. "Listen," he said quietly to Thomas, "just follow my lead. I'll make this quick and easy. No one wants to see you get hurt." Thomas nodded gratefully, appreciating the Master Sergeant's consideration. He had no ego to protect in this situation. He simply wanted to get through the demonstration without embarrassing himself too badly or disrupting the training schedule. The general positioned himself where he could observe every detail of what was about to unfold. His request had seemed spontaneous, but those who knew him well recognized the calculating look in his eyes. General Morrison rarely did anything without purpose, though his reasoning was not always immediately apparent. As the two men faced each other in the center of the courtyard, the contrast was striking. Rodriguez stood in a confident fighting stance, his muscles tensed and ready for action. Thomas stood awkwardly, unsure where to put his hands or how to position his feet. He looked more like someone waiting in line at the grocery store than a participant in a combat demonstration. "The key to effective combat," Rodriguez announced to his audience, "is reading your opponent and responding appropriately to their capabilities and intentions." He began circling Thomas slowly, demonstrating proper footwork and positioning. Thomas tried to mirror the movement but succeeded only in looking more uncomfortable. His civilian background showed in every uncertain step. The watching soldiers began to lose interest, assuming they were about to witness a brief and predictable conclusion to this unusual demonstration. Rodriguez moved closer, preparing to demonstrate a basic restraint technique that would end the exercise quickly and cleanly. He had performed similar demonstrations hundreds of times, and his confidence was absolute. There was no reason to expect this encounter would be any different from countless others. But as Rodriguez reached out to begin the demonstration, something unexpected happened. Thomas, in his nervousness and inexperience, reacted in a way that no trained fighter would have anticipated. Instead of responding with conventional defensive techniques, he moved with the unpredictable awkwardness of someone who had never learned proper combat form. The general watched intently, his experienced eye catching subtle details that others missed. What appeared to be random, clumsy movement to most observers contained elements that intrigued him. Sometimes, he knew, the absence of formal training could create opportunities that rigorous preparation might eliminate. Rodriguez paused, slightly thrown off by Thomas's unconventional positioning. He had expected compliance or basic defensive reactions, not this strange combination of nervousness and unpredictable movement. For the first time in years, he found himself uncertain about how to proceed with the demonstration. The moment stretched longer than anyone expected, creating a tension that no one had anticipated when the exercise began. Rodriguez decided to proceed with a standard arm control technique, something he had demonstrated countless times without incident. He reached for Thomas's wrist with practiced precision, intending to guide him into a controlled position that would showcase proper restraint methods. The movement should have been routine, textbook perfect and completely predictable. But Thomas, overwhelmed by nervousness and acting purely on instinct, jerked away from the approaching hand. His reaction was neither trained nor calculated. It was simply the natural response of someone who had spent years avoiding physical confrontation. In his panic, he stumbled backward and to the side, creating an angle that Rodriguez had not anticipated. The Master Sergeant, committed to his intended technique and expecting normal defensive responses, found himself slightly off balance as his target moved in an unexpected direction. It was a minor adjustment, nothing that should have caused problems for someone of his experience and training. He quickly compensated and moved to re-establish his position. Thomas, seeing Rodriguez approaching again, made another instinctive movement. This time he stepped forward and to his right, a direction that made no tactical sense but happened to place him in Rodriguez's blind spot for a crucial moment. The clerk's movements were erratic and unpredictable because they were born of genuine fear rather than strategic thinking. The watching soldiers began to murmur among themselves. What should have been a quick demonstration was becoming an awkward dance between a master fighter and a terrified clerk. Some laughed nervously, unsure whether they were witnessing comedy or something more serious. Others felt embarrassed for both participants. General Morrison remained silent and focused, his sharp eyes tracking every movement and reaction. What others saw as awkward stumbling, he recognized as something potentially more significant. The unpredictability that was frustrating Rodriguez might also be creating opportunities that conventional training would never produce. Rodriguez, growing slightly impatient with the prolonged demonstration, decided to end the exercise with a quick takedown. He moved with increased speed and determination, using techniques that had never failed him before. His approach was flawless from a technical standpoint, executed with the precision that had made him a respected instructor. Thomas saw the Master Sergeant coming toward him with obvious intent and reacted with pure panic. Without thinking, he threw his hands up defensively and took a quick step backward. His foot caught on an uneven piece of pavement, causing him to stumble and fall to one knee. As Thomas dropped unexpectedly, Rodriguez found himself suddenly overextended. His momentum, calculated for an opponent who would remain standing, carried him forward into empty space. For a split second, the experienced fighter was off balance and vulnerable, his perfect technique compromised by an opponent who refused to behave predictably. In that moment of vulnerability, something extraordinary happened. Thomas, still on one knee and acting purely on instinct, reached out to break his fall. His hand happened to catch Rodriguez's ankle at exactly the moment when the Master Sergeant was most off balance. What should have been an insignificant touch became a pivot point that sent the larger man stumbling forward. Rodriguez, shocked by this turn of events, tried to regain his balance but found himself fighting against momentum and an awkward position. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, but not for an opponent who moved without strategy or predictable patterns. He stumbled several steps before managing to steady himself, his face flushed with surprise and embarrassment. The courtyard fell completely silent. Soldiers who had been chatting or joking moments before now stood with their mouths open, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the man who could supposedly handle any opponent on the base, had just been made to stumble by a nervous clerk who seemed barely capable of standing upright. Thomas looked up from his position on the ground, equally shocked by what had happened. He had not intended to trip anyone, had not planned any kind of offensive action. He was simply trying to avoid falling down completely, and somehow his defensive reaction had affected the Master Sergeant's balance. He began to apologize immediately. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to. I was just trying not to fall. I never intended to." Rodriguez held up a hand to stop Thomas's apologies, but his expression showed clear frustration and confusion. This was not how demonstrations were supposed to proceed. His reputation was built on control and predictability, and both had just been compromised by someone who shouldn't have posed any challenge whatsoever. "Let's try this again," Rodriguez said, his voice slightly strained. He was determined to conclude the demonstration properly and restore the natural order of things. "Stand up and we'll run through this one more time." Thomas got to his feet reluctantly, brushing dust from his uniform. He could feel the weight of dozens of stares and wanted nothing more than to disappear. The attention was exactly what he had spent his entire life trying to avoid, and now he was trapped in the center of it with no escape. General Morrison stepped closer to the action, his interest clearly heightened by the unexpected development. "Continue," he instructed simply, but there was something in his tone that suggested he was seeing exactly what he had hoped to see. Rodriguez approached more cautiously this time, his professional pride demanding that he handle this situation properly. He could not allow a simple clerk to make him look incompetent in front of the base commander and half the enlisted personnel. His reputation and authority depended on demonstrating clear superiority in this type of encounter. But as he moved toward Thomas again, Rodriguez discovered that his opponent had become even more unpredictable. The clerk's nervousness had intensified after the previous exchange, making his movements even more erratic and difficult to read. What had been merely awkward before was now becoming genuinely chaotic. Thomas's second attempt at the demonstration would prove even more surprising than his first, setting up a confrontation that would shock everyone present and change how they viewed both combat and the quiet clerk who had stumbled into the spotlight. Rodriguez's second approach was more methodical and controlled. He had analyzed what went wrong during the first attempt and adjusted his strategy accordingly. This time he would account for Thomas's unpredictable movements and nervous reactions. He moved more slowly with greater caution, determined to demonstrate the proper techniques without further embarrassment. But Thomas's anxiety had reached new heights after the first incident. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears, and his hands trembled slightly as he tried to prepare for whatever was coming next. The weight of all those watching eyes made him feel exposed and vulnerable in a way he had never experienced before. As Rodriguez closed the distance between them, Thomas's nervous system went into full panic mode. Years of conflict avoidance had not prepared him for this moment of forced confrontation. His breathing became shallow and rapid, and his vision seemed to narrow until he could only focus on the approaching Master Sergeant. Rodriguez reached out again, this time with a different technique designed to control Thomas's movement and bring the demonstration to a quick, clean conclusion. His form was perfect, his execution flawless, and his confidence restored by careful planning and adjusted expectations. Thomas saw the hand coming toward him and reacted with the desperation of someone who felt completely trapped. Without conscious thought, he twisted away from the reaching hand, his body moving with the frantic energy of pure survival instinct. His movement was neither graceful nor trained, but it was sudden and completely unexpected. The twist took Thomas in a direction that Rodriguez had not anticipated, causing the Master Sergeant to overreach slightly as he tried to maintain contact. Rodriguez quickly adjusted, his years of training allowing him to adapt to the unexpected movement. But the adjustment required him to shift his weight in a way that left him momentarily vulnerable. In that instant of vulnerability, Thomas's panic reached a critical point. Feeling cornered and desperate, he made a movement that surprised everyone present, including himself. Instead of continuing to retreat or defend, he suddenly stepped forward, directly into Rodriguez's personal space. The forward movement was not an attack in any conventional sense. Thomas had no training in offensive techniques and no intention of hurting anyone. It was simply the erratic behavior of someone whose fight-or-flight response had been triggered beyond his ability to control it. But the timing and angle of his movement created a situation that Rodriguez's extensive training had not prepared him for. As Thomas stepped forward, his shoulder made contact with Rodriguez's chest at the exact moment when the Master Sergeant was shifting his weight to compensate for the clerk's previous movement. The contact was neither hard nor intentional, but it came at precisely the wrong moment for Rodriguez's balance and positioning. Rodriguez found himself being pushed backward by the unexpected forward pressure, his careful positioning completely disrupted by Thomas's irrational movement. He tried to use his superior strength and training to regain control, but Thomas's panic-driven actions continued to defy every logical expectation. Thomas, now in closer contact than he had ever wanted to be, reacted with even greater desperation. He pushed and twisted simultaneously, not with any technique or strategy, but with the wild energy of someone who felt trapped and needed to escape at any cost. His movements were chaotic and uncoordinated, but they created a series of forces and angles that Rodriguez could not predict or counter effectively. The Master Sergeant tried to establish a controlling grip, but Thomas's clothing was slippery with nervous perspiration, and his constant erratic movement made it impossible to maintain proper holds. Rodriguez found himself fighting not just against an opponent, but against the complete absence of recognizable patterns or techniques. In conventional combat, fighters rely on their ability to read opponents and respond to predictable movements and strategies. But Thomas had no strategy, no recognizable techniques, and no predictable patterns. He was pure chaos in human form, driven by panic and desperation rather than training or intention. Rodriguez stepped backward to create space and reset the encounter, but Thomas followed him, not out of aggression but because his panic-driven mind interpreted the backward movement as an opportunity to escape. The clerk pressed forward with desperate energy, his hands pushing and grasping without coordination or purpose. The continued forward pressure from Thomas, combined with his unpredictable movements, began to seriously compromise Rodriguez's balance and positioning. The Master Sergeant found himself being forced backward by someone who should have posed no physical threat whatsoever. His training told him to establish distance and control, but Thomas's chaotic energy made both objectives impossible to achieve. General Morrison watched with growing fascination as the demonstration evolved far beyond anything he had expected. What he was witnessing challenged conventional assumptions about combat training and predictable outcomes. The trained fighter was being overwhelmed not by superior skill, but by the complete absence of recognizable skill. The crowd of watching soldiers had fallen completely silent, transfixed by the impossible scene unfolding before them. Their respect for Rodriguez's abilities remained unchanged, but they were witnessing something that defied their understanding of how physical confrontations were supposed to work. Rodriguez made one more attempt to establish control using a technique that had never failed him before. But as he moved to implement the hold, Thomas's panic reached its absolute peak. The clerk's desperate energy exploded into a final burst of chaotic movement that would determine the outcome of this unprecedented encounter. What happened next would be talked about on the base for years to come. A story that would grow in the telling but never quite capture the surreal reality of the moment when panic defeated preparation and chaos overcame control. Thomas's final surge of panicked energy manifested in a wild, uncontrolled combination of pushing, twisting, and stumbling that defied all logic and training. His movements had no pattern, no technique, and no conscious strategy. They were simply the physical expression of a mind that had reached its breaking point under pressure. Rodriguez, committed to his planned technique and expecting at least some semblance of normal resistance, found himself completely unprepared for what amounted to controlled chaos. As he moved to establish his hold, Thomas suddenly dropped to one knee again, not from any tactical decision, but because his trembling legs could no longer support him properly under the stress. The unexpected drop in height caused Rodriguez to lean forward and down, following his intended target. But Thomas, in his desperate attempt to escape the situation, immediately tried to stand back up, creating an upward surge of movement that met Rodriguez's downward momentum at exactly the wrong angle. The collision of these opposing forces, Thomas rising in panic and Rodriguez descending with purpose, created a leverage situation that favored the person moving upward. Physics and timing combined in a way that neither participant could have planned or predicted, turning Thomas's desperate escape attempt into an inadvertent offensive action. Rodriguez felt his balance completely compromised as Thomas's upward movement caught him at his most vulnerable point. His superior strength and training became irrelevant when basic physics took control of the situation. The master sergeant found himself being lifted and pushed backward by forces he could not counter or control. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Rodriguez stumbled backward, his arms windmilling as he tried to regain his balance. His face showed complete shock and disbelief as he realized what was happening to him. For several long steps he fought against momentum and gravity, but the physics of the situation had already been determined. Thomas, still in the grip of panic, continued his desperate upward and forward movement without any awareness of what he was accomplishing. His only goal was to escape the confrontation, but his escape attempt had become the decisive factor in an encounter that was supposed to showcase Rodriguez's superior abilities. Rodriguez's backward momentum finally overcame his ability to recover. His heel caught on a small depression in the pavement, and he fell heavily onto his back, his arms spread wide to break his fall. The sound of his body hitting the ground echoed across the silent courtyard like a thunderclap. Thomas, suddenly free from the physical contact that had triggered his panic, stumbled forward several more steps before realizing that the confrontation was over. He turned around to see Rodriguez lying on the ground, looking up at the sky with an expression of complete bewilderment. The silence in the courtyard stretched for what felt like an eternity. Dozens of soldiers stood frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the man who had never lost a physical confrontation, the instructor who had trained hundreds of fighters, lay flat on his back, defeated by a terrified clerk who didn't even know what he had done. Thomas looked around at the sea of shocked faces and immediately assumed he had done something terribly wrong. "I'm so sorry," he blurted out, rushing toward Rodriguez to offer assistance. "Are you hurt? I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I don't know what I was trying to do." Rodriguez sat up slowly, his professional composure shattered but his basic decency intact. He was not injured physically, but his pride and reputation had taken a severe blow. However, he was experienced enough to recognize that what had happened was not the result of superior skill or training on Thomas's part, but rather a perfect storm of circumstances that could never be replicated. "I'm fine," Rodriguez said quietly, accepting Thomas's offered hand to help him stand. That was unexpected. He brushed dust from his uniform and tried to restore some semblance of dignity to the situation. General Morrison stepped forward, his expression unreadable. The other soldiers continued to stare in shocked silence, waiting for someone to explain what they had just witnessed or to tell them it had all been some kind of elaborate joke. "Thank you both," the general said formally. "That was very instructive." His choice of words was careful and deliberate, suggesting that what they had witnessed was somehow planned or expected, though everyone present knew that nothing about the encounter had been predictable. Thomas retrieved his glasses from his shirt pocket and put them back on, his hands still trembling slightly. The weight of what had happened was beginning to sink in, though he still did not fully understand how a routine administrative task had led to him somehow defeating the base's most respected combat instructor. Rodriguez straightened his uniform and squared his shoulders, trying to reclaim some of his professional authority. "Class dismissed," he announced to the watching soldiers, his voice carrying a forced confidence that fooled no one. "Return to your regular duties." The soldiers began to disperse slowly, many of them casting backward glances at the unlikely scene they were leaving behind. They walked away in small groups, their conversations animated but conducted in hushed tones. What they had witnessed would be discussed and analyzed for weeks to come, but none of them would ever fully explain or understand it. General Morrison approached Thomas, who was gathering his scattered files from the bench where he had left them. The clerk's face was still flushed with embarrassment and confusion, and he fumbled with the papers as he tried to restore them to proper order. "Walk with me," the general said simply, and Thomas had no choice but to follow, clutching his files and wondering what additional consequences might result from his inadvertent involvement in the morning's extraordinary events. General Morrison led Thomas away from the dispersing crowd toward a quieter section of the base. They walked in silence for several minutes, the general's measured pace giving Thomas time to collect his thoughts and regain some composure. The morning's events felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else, and Thomas kept expecting to wake up from what surely must be a dream. "Tell me about yourself," the general said finally as they reached a bench overlooking the base's training fields. It was not a request but a gentle command, delivered in the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed but not interested in intimidation. Thomas sat down carefully, still clutching his files. "There's not much to tell, sir. I grew up in a small town outside Pittsburgh. My parents worked hard to make ends meet, and they taught me the value of honest work and staying out of trouble. I joined the Army because it offered steady employment and a chance to serve my country, even if it's just in a small way." "What did you do before the military?" "I worked in various office jobs, sir. Filing, data entry, customer service. I was good with details and organization, but I never had much ambition beyond doing my work well and not causing problems for anyone." Thomas adjusted his glasses nervously. "I've always tried to avoid conflict, sir. What happened back there? I honestly don't understand it." General Morrison studied Thomas's face carefully. "What you did back there was remarkable, though I suspect you don't realize why." Thomas looked confused. "Sir, I didn't really do anything. I was terrified the whole time. I just reacted without thinking, and somehow Master Sergeant Rodriguez lost his balance. It was an accident, a fluke. I certainly didn't defeat him through any skill or training." "That's exactly why it was remarkable," the general replied. "Do you know why I asked you to volunteer for that demonstration?" "No, sir. I assumed you made a mistake or were testing something I don't understand." The general smiled slightly. "I've been observing personnel on this base for months looking for something specific. Most of our soldiers are well-trained, predictable and effective within established parameters. But real combat, real crisis situations don't always follow established parameters." Thomas listened intently but still did not understand where the conversation was leading. "What you demonstrated today was something that can't be taught in any training program, the ability to succeed through unpredictability when conventional methods fail. Your panic, your complete lack of technique, your chaotic movements, they created a situation that Master Sergeant Rodriguez's extensive training couldn't handle." "But sir, that's not a good thing, is it? I was terrified and out of control. That's not the kind of behavior the military needs." General Morrison leaned back on the bench, his expression thoughtful. "There's a special operations unit that occasionally needs personnel who can think and act outside conventional parameters. People who can succeed in situations where training and predictability might actually be disadvantages. What happened today suggests you might have qualities that could be valuable in very specific circumstances." Thomas felt a chill of fear. "Sir, I'm not special operations material. I'm a clerk who processes paperwork and tries not to bother anyone. I don't want to hurt people or be in dangerous situations. I'm not talking about making you a commando or sending you into combat, the general explained. But there are situations where someone with your particular qualities, your ability to remain unnoticed, your instinct for avoiding direct confrontation, your tendency to react in unexpected ways under pressure, might be exactly what's needed. The conversation continued for another hour, with the general explaining opportunities that Thomas had never imagined, and asking questions that revealed aspects of his personality and capabilities that even Thomas hadn't recognized. The discussion was both flattering and terrifying, offering possibilities that seemed far beyond his comfort zone. As the meeting concluded, General Morrison stood and prepared to return to his duties. I want you to think about what we've discussed. There's no pressure to make any immediate decisions, but I believe you have untapped potential that could serve your country in ways you never considered. Thomas returned to his regular duties that afternoon, but everything felt different. His colleagues treated him with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect, though he had asked them to keep the morning's events quiet. Word had already spread throughout the base, however, and he found himself the subject of whispered conversations and speculative glances. Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached him later in the day, his professional demeanor intact but his attitude notably changed. I wanted to thank you for this morning, Rodriguez said quietly. What happened taught me something important about assumptions and overconfidence. I've been instructing combat techniques for years, but I'd forgotten that the most dangerous opponents are often the ones who don't follow any rules or patterns. Over the following weeks, Thomas found himself facing a decision that would determine the direction of his entire career. The general's offer represented opportunities he had never dreamed of, but also challenges that terrified him. His quiet, predictable life could continue unchanged, or he could step into a role that would test every assumption he had ever made about his own capabilities. The modest clerk who had accidentally defeated a master, Sergeant discovered that sometimes the most significant victories come not from strength or skill, but from being exactly who you are at exactly the right moment. His choice would determine whether that single moment of unexpected triumph would remain an amusing story or become the foundation for a completely different kind of service to his country.